letting the laughter swell once more. But this time, something changed. The laughter wasn't as full. Not as certain. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some glanced back at Barron, realizing that perhaps this joke had gone too far. Then, Barron moved, with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent his entire life under the weight of scrutiny. He unclasped his hands, pushed back his chair, and stood up. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. The air in the room seemed to shift as heads turned. Conversations halted, and even Dr. Whitmore, mid-smirk, faltered slightly. Barron's voice was steady, even. "Professor," he began, his tone polite but firm. "You seem to enjoy reducing people to the simplest version of themselves. Let's test that theory." The room fell into absolute silence. Dr. Whitmore, caught off guard but unwilling to relinquish control, leaned against the podium, arms crossed. "All right, Barron," he said, an edge of amusement in his voice. "Let's hear it." Barron took a slow breath, eyes locking onto the professor with unwavering intensity. "You say my mother contributed nothing. That she was only there at the right time, next to the right man. But if standing beside someone powerful is all it takes, then by that logic, you're only here because of tenure, not because you have anything meaningful to say." A few gasps rippled through the room. Some students stifled laughter. Others sat up straighter, suddenly realizing that this wasn't going to be the exchange they had expected. Dr. Whitmore let out a tight chuckle. "Touché," he said, clearly trying to regain control. "But my job is to challenge perspectives, too." Barron didn't let him finish. "Challenge perspectives?" His voice was calm, but there was a sharpness to it now. "You mean mock people who aren't here to defend themselves? It's easy to stand up there and ridicule someone when you don't have to face them. Would you have said that to my mother's face? Or are you just the kind of man who picks safe targets?" The professor's expression hardened. "I think you're taking this a little too personally." Barron let out a short, humorless laugh. "You mean I'm holding you to the same standard you claim to hold others to?" He took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. "You stand in front of a room full of students and talk about intelligence, about contribution, as if mocking someone's life choices makes you the authority on their worth. My mother speaks 5 languages. She built a career long before she ever met my father. She's worked in business, in fashion, in diplomacy, and yes, she led a campaign against cyberbullying while being mocked by people like you. If you think that's doing nothing, maybe the problem isn't her. Maybe it's how little you actually understand." A hushed murmur spread through the hall. A few students nodded, whispering to each other. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others seemed impressed, watching as a professor who had built his reputation on sharp wit suddenly found himself without a clever retort. Dr. Whitmore opened his mouth to speak, but Barron wasn't finished. "You claim to be an educator," Barron continued, his voice unwavering. "But education is about presenting ideas, not ridiculing people. What you're doing isn't teaching. It's grandstanding. It's standing behind a podium and taking cheap shots at someone you think can't fight back." He tilted his head slightly. "Except, today, you're wrong." The professor's smirk was gone now. His lips pressed together tightly, his arms unfolding as he shifted his stance. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. Especially not by a student. Especially not by the student. Barron took a final step forward. "You're right about one thing, though," he said, his voice now carrying through every inch of the room. "My mother isn't Eleanor Roosevelt. She never pretended to be. But she carried herself with grace while being torn apart by the same media that would have called her strong if she had a different last name. You say she didn't contribute? Fine, but tell me, Professor, when this class ends today, will anything you said matter? Or will it just be another joke?" Silence. Dr. Whitmore's jaw tensed. He could feel the weight of the room shifting against him. This wasn't just a witty comeback, this was a reckoning. Barron didn't wait for a response. He simply picked up his notebook, nodded once, and walked out. The room remained frozen for several seconds before, slowly, one student clapped, then another, until finally, a wave of applause filled the space. Dr. Whitmore stood there, silent, as the sound of his own lecture hall turning against him echoed in his ears. That day, he had intended to make an example out of Melania Trump. Instead, Barron Trump had made an example out of him. Many of them looked up at him, some with respect, some with quiet admiration, and others with something closer to shame. A few of the students who had laughed the loudest now avoided his gaze entirely. Dr. Whitmore remained at the front of the room, his hand still gripping the edge of the podium. He opened his mouth slightly, as if to call after Barron, to regain control of the moment, to say something, anything, that would restore his authority. But nothing came. Nothing he could say would undo what had just happened. Barron didn't pause, didn't look back. He reached the heavy double doors at the back of the lecture hall, pushed one open, and stepped through. The door swung shut behind him with a quiet finality. And in that moment, the lesson was over. The silence in the room lingered long after he was gone. Dr. Whitmore exhaled, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had built his reputation on quick wit and sharp comebacks, on being the one who always had the last word. But today, for the first time in years, he had none. The class wasn't laughing anymore. For the students who had been in that room, the lesson they had witnessed wasn't in the syllabus, wasn't on the PowerPoint slides, wasn't something they could jot down in their notebooks and review for an exam. But it was something they would remember. Because in that moment, Barron Trump had done something rare. He had refused to stay silent. He had refused to let a cheap insult slide. And most importantly, he had turned the tables on a man who had never expected to be held accountable for his own words. For years, people had spoken about Melania Trump as if she were an easy target, as if she were nothing more than a footnote in her husband's legacy. But today, in that classroom, Barron had shattered that illusion. And the most powerful part? He hadn't needed to raise his voice. He hadn't needed to insult anyone. He had simply spoken the truth. And in doing so, he had left an entire room full of young minds with a question they would have to sit with long after they walked out of that lecture hall. How many times had they let someone get away with saying something simply because no one had the courage to challenge it? That was the real lesson of the day. And no one, least of all Dr. Whitmore, would forget it. The lecture hall at Brown University had seen countless debates, but none quite like this. For years, Dr. Jonathan Whitmore had controlled the room with his sharp wit and sarcastic jabs, pushing the limits of what was acceptable under the guise of intellectual discourse. He was the kind of professor who could mock a public figure, get a few laughs, and move on without consequence. But today, something changed. Today, someone pushed back. As Barron Trump walked toward the door, the usual energy of the class had shifted. Some students sat frozen, their eyes still locked on the front of the room, processing what had just happened. Others exchanged hurried whispers, glancing between each other in disbelief. Did that actually just happen? I've never seen Whitmore shut down like that. I didn't even know Barron talked. Dr. Whitmore, still standing at the podium, adjusted his tie with slow, deliberate movements. His smirk had faded, replaced with a carefully controlled expression. He let out a forced chuckle, as if trying to brush off what had just happened. Well, he said, voice measured but missing its usual authority. That was unexpected, but let's get back on track. He tried to reclaim control of the room, but the weight of the moment hung over him like a shadow. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one leading the conversation. Barron, meanwhile, kept walking. He wasn't angry, not really. He had expected the jokes, the dismissive comments, but what surprised him was how easily he had shut it down. Not with outrage, not with insults, just with truth. As he rounded the corner outside the lecture hall, a voice called after him. Hey, Barron, wait up. He stopped, turning slightly. A small group of students, 3 guys, 2 girls, hurried toward him. He recognized a few of them from previous lectures. One of them, Liam, a broad-shouldered sophomore, was the first to speak. Dude, Liam said, shaking his head, that was insane. I've never seen anyone shut Whitmore down like that. Sophie, a girl with glasses who usually kept to herself, added, honestly, I always thought he was kind of full of himself. But no one ever called him out before. Isaiah, another student, let out a short laugh. Man, the way you said, you know nothing about my mother. That hit different. Barron shrugged. I just said what needed to be said. There was a pause, the kind that carried more weight than words. Then Liam grinned. Yeah, well, you earned my respect today. Man. The others nodded in agreement. And just like that, something unspoken passed between them. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't about his last name. It was about something deeper, standing up when it mattered. But the moment didn't just stay in that hallway. It was about to spread much further than anyone expected. Going viral. By the time Barron got back to his dorm, his phone was buzzing nonstop. Texts, missed calls, notifications piling up. Someone had recorded the exchange in class. Now, clips of him shutting down Dr. Whitmore were making the rounds online. At first, he considered ignoring it. He hadn't spoken up to get attention. He had spoken up because it was the right thing to do. But then, as he scrolled through his messages, something caught his eye. A DM from someone he didn't know. "I'm not a fan of your family. But today, you earned my respect." Another one. "My mom was an immigrant too. People act like she's less than because of her accent. Thanks for saying something." And another. "I used to laugh at jokes like that. Today made me think twice. You're right, it's lazy." Barron set his phone down and stared at the wall for a moment. This wasn't about winning an argument. It wasn't about proving a professor wrong. It was about how quickly people accepted tearing others down as normal. And how sometimes, it only took one voice to change that. The aftermath. The next time Dr. Whitmore held class, the energy was different. He still lectured with confidence. He still made bold statements. But he didn't crack jokes about Melania Trump. He didn't go for cheap shots to get a laugh. Maybe he had learned something that day. Maybe he hadn't. But everyone else had. For years, the world had told Barron Trump to stay quiet. Let people say what they wanted. Ignore the headlines. Ignore the jokes. Let them believe what they wanted to believe. But respect isn't given. It's earned. And when you speak the truth, not to argue, not to impress, but because it needs to be said, people listen. Even the ones who weren't ready to hear it. In life, there will always be moments when people try to diminish others for a quick laugh. A sense of superiority. Or to follow the crowd. But true strength comes from standing up, not with anger. Not with insults, but with truth and dignity. Barron's response teaches us that defending what's right doesn't require shouting, it requires confidence, knowledge, and composure. The world may encourage silence, but real respect is earned by those who speak when it matters most. So, the next time you witness injustice, don't be afraid to be the voice that shifts the conversation.